And I'm gonna try to do screen sharing. I seem to be unable to share the screen without seeing what you're seeing. Um, so I'm hopeful. Can you see the?
PowerPoint, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think as you all know, and I can't see people, so speak up if you want to interrupt me uh, to say something or ask a question. Uh, just just barge in because I can't see it. I can only see a couple of people on my corner screen. Uh, what I'm going to talk about today is a book, The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. It was published. Should have looked this. 2020. So it was published during the election, but obviously before January 6th. Um, and the proposition in the book is basically a couple of things. So I'll just go to the summary here. The first point of the book is that the Gilded Age that ran from like about 1870 to 1918 had many of the same problems and many of the same characteristics as America does today. And the narrative that the book provides is that in the Gilded Age, at various different levels, we operated with a focus on I, with a focus on individualism, and a lesser focus on community or the needs of the community. And then during the Progressive era and on into the New Deal and into the post-war era, we moved to a focus on we. We had programs that were targeted to produce community results. And then after and during the 1960s, that trend shifted back towards a focus on I that has culminated in where we are today, which is a lot like the Gilded Age. And the book talks about this process on four different levels. Economic equality. So under this scenario, economic equality, there was great inequality during the Gilded Age. All those differences narrowed, and that narrowing, what he refers to as the convergence, peaked in the early 1960s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and then slowly began to reverse, and then that reversal accelerated over the following 60 some years. The other area he talks about is what he refers to as political tribalism, that the Gilded Age was a period of very little bipartisan political action, very partisan period, and a lot of political division and political violence. That lessened and entered into a bipartisan era, starting with progressive legislation and going through the New Deal and all the way through the mid-60s and the Great Society. And then that bipartisanship started to reverse until we reach the level of polarization we have today. The other area he talks about are social relationships, associations, and social cohesion. According to this narrative, during the Gilded Age, it was a period of significant isolation. Community relations weren't strong. Community associations weren't strong. There wasn't a lot of social cohesion. All of those things began reversing through the Progressive era. Our social structures became stronger, healthier, more vibrant, culminating again in the 1950s and 1960s, and then they began to reverse. And in this regard, he pays a lot of attention to, and we'll come back to, the rise and fall of religions and churches. And then in the culture, philosophical, religious, and ideological views, all of those areas tend to focus more on I during the Gilded Age. I meaning my own personal profit when it comes to the economy. I meaning my liberation from community norms. And I meaning a focus in terms of religion on more on my personal salvation and less on a social ethic. And although that focus on I switched more to a we focus from the progressive era, culminating actually, and one of the things he uses as the point of culmination is JFK's inaugural address, where he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country, which was the ultimate articulation of the communitarian spirit. And then, from then, it began to decline and become another, again, a focus more on I and less on we. Then the third point he makes is the progressive era and its progeny, the New Deal, and he considers the New Deal to be very much a product of the progressive era, produced change that overcame many of the problems of the Gilded Age, problems that we have again today. And his proposition is that we may learn something from the history of the changes, both what they did right and what they did wrong. But then he ends, and one of his major points, and this may be particularly apropos for this group, is that the major part of any reform, Putnam writes, must be and has been a moral awakening. And that occurred during the progressive era. And it was led to a great extent by churches. We'll come back to that. Also by nonprofit associations, by unions, and by journalism and literature that started to focus on some of these problems. But that is, if you will, a summary that I'm going to try to put more meat on now. What are the similarities between the Gilded Age, which again broadly defines runs from 1865 to 1914, and the present? Well, the first in the economic area was that was a period of rapid economic expansion, just as our period has been one of rapid economic expansion. It was also a period of extreme economic inequality. And it's not only a period of rapid economic expansion, but it was a transition of our society during the Gilded Age from a primarily agricultural society to a primarily industrial society, from a primarily rural society and small towns to a primarily urban society, from a primarily a society in which most people worked for themselves, either as tradesmen or farmers, to a society in which most people worked for a corporation. And that change had tremendous impact politically and socially. During the Gilded Age, there was substantial political violence. If you read that period and read of some of the union fights, literally armies, the union workers against the United States Army and workers against private police forces hired by employers, when the workers attempted to strike and the company attempted to break the strike. And during the Gilded Age, there were no laws that really regulated unions, in the sense that it didn't give unions had no right, and it was difficult to form unions. And we'll come back to those things. It was a period, the Gilded Age, of social isolation, because as people moved from the farms and rural areas to the cities, they left behind most of their social relationships and social structures and institutions. The same for immigrants moving to the United States, to those same cities. There was a substantial isolation. The Gilded Age was a period of regression in terms of racial equality. We went from the constitutional amendments after the Civil War that were to abolish slavery and create equality and Reconstruction. We went from that to Jim Crow, and political violence in the form of lynching. And it was a period of opposition to a push for sexual equality, even as women became a powerful political force. So all those aspects of our time were also reflected in that earlier time. Now, the Gilded Age was followed by the Progressive era. That was Teddy Roosevelt, that was Woodrow Wilson. Even I was surprised to learn Herbert Hoover was a progressive. And there were a huge number of reforms that occurred both at the state level and actually initially at the state level, and then at the federal level, culminating in even greater reforms during the New Deal. But even after the New Deal, after World War II, there were other substantial reforms in American society that embodied this communitarian reformist spirit up until the mid-60s. The 60s, according to Putnam, were the hinge decade, after which the problems of the prior Gilded Age began to reemerge and have now reached a crisis stage. Now, I'll say his narrative of how and why the shift in the mid-60s to a more I-focused and less we-focused culture and society, I'm not sure I agree with all of what he says, or maybe even most of what he says, because I tend to think that the conservative movement and the Republican Party had much more to do with it than a lot of the forces that he focuses on. But it's an important narrative to hear and to evaluate. And his overarching lesson, as I've said before, is we need to go from I to we. The overarching lesson is that we went from I to we and back to I. And we need now to reestablish a balance. Now, I'll take each of his areas. Economics. Income inequality peaked where it was very high during the Gilded Age. It converged. Income differentials narrowed considerably from the period of the Gilded Age through to the 1960s, with the exception of the Roaring Twenties, where they increased again. The same thing happened, and of course, after the 1960s, inequality in income started to expand again. To now we've reached levels now that are as bad as, and maybe by some measures worse than, the Gilded Age. Wealth inequality is even greater than income inequality, because wealth inequality, the number of people that can accumulate wealth, is even smaller than the number of people that can earn income. So the wealth inequality has reflected that same convergence, narrowing of the inequality until it gets to its lowest levels in the 50s and early 60s, and then starts to expand again to its highest levels now. Another area is class mobility. During the Gilded Age, there was very little class mobility, or ability to move from a lower income level to a higher income level. The percentage of people who did that was small. The percentage of people who did that started increasing after the Gilded Age, and again, that, according to Putnam, peaked in the 1950s and 1960s, and now mobility between classes or from one income group to another has declined dramatically now. In fact, that class mobility, immobility, may be, to my way of thinking, perhaps the single biggest social problem and political problem that we have now. And it's reflected within that immobility is the problem of racism. Now, what are the reasons for the convergence and the divergence? I mean, why did these things get better from the Gilded Age until the 60s and then get worse after? Well, and why was there such extreme inequality? In the Gilded Age and in our age, the failure of education to keep pace with technological change is part of the reason. And one of the reforms that was made during the Progressive era that Putnam thinks was extremely important was the introduction of universal free high school. Now today we take it for granted that you should be able to go to high school for free, and anyone who, in fact, not only wants to, but even some who don't want to, must go to high school. But during the Gilded Age and in the early parts of the 1900s, that was not the case. And in fact, the movement to create universal free high schools started at a local level. It wasn't a federal project. And it expanded all over the United States by local groups instituting universal free secondary education. The other aspect of technological change that has to do with this inequality in income, wealth, and class mobility is that it's what I'll call the first mover phenomenon. Is whoever first captures the new technology can profit from it to an extraordinary extent. So, and whoever can consolidate that the businesses around that technology can prosper to an extraordinary extent. So there is at least a correlation, and I think a lot of people think that there is a causative relation between technological change creating greater inequality because of the very few who can take advantage of the new technology in terms of profiting from it, and the very many who don't understand it or know it. So that today our problem seems to be between a transition from an industrial society to a digital or computer society, where many people who previously were employed in an industrial structure don't have the skills to be as gainfully employed in the new digital economy. Another factor with respect to inequality is globalization. A lot of people don't know that the United States, the highest percentage of the U.S. GDP attributable to imports and exports, in other words, global trade, was achieved before World War I, during this Gilded Age. And then it dropped off dramatically after that, in part because of the Depression, in part because of wars. And it never reached the level that existed before World War I again until just in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, a lot of people think that globalization, particularly in the area of labor, drove down wages. And I think in the United States it clearly did. That a lot of what manufacturing capacity we needed was offshored for lower labor costs. That's now being reversed for a lot of reasons, but to a certain extent, globalization was a problem during the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, though, business protected itself with tariffs. And the irony was that the populist movement were anti-tariffs because they wanted the cheaper goods from overseas, and the businesses, the major and powerful businesses, wanted high tariffs because they wanted to protect their market from competition from overseas. But immigration to the United States kept labor costs down during that period, just as it's now claimed, with probably less evidence, that immigration keeps labor costs down in the United States now. The convergence was led in significant part by the introduction of universal free high school education and expanding college opportunity. In other words, the income inequality was narrowed and greater inequality resulted. Unions also had a major role in reducing inequality. And yet, after the 1960s, both politically and legally, unions have been disadvantaged in a host of ways. During the Gilded Age, they were disadvantaged in a host of ways, and it was progressive labor legislation and, even more importantly, New Deal labor legislation that actually finally gave unions the ability to negotiate and strike and gave workers the leverage to demand better benefits and wages. Another aspect of the income inequality was regressive to progressive taxation. Taxation in the beginning of the Gilded Age or during the Gilded Age was regressive, meaning the percentage tax burden was higher on the low-income people than it was on the wealthy. Because at that point in time, most taxation, particularly at the federal level, was taxation in the form of like a sales tax or an excise tax. The income tax was introduced during and after the Civil War. There was a very small income tax. Then the United States Supreme Court in, I think it was the 1890s, declared the income tax unconstitutional. And consequently, the Constitution needed to be amended to allow for the federal income tax. That occurred in about 1918, 1919 in connection, not coincidentally, with Prohibition. That's an interesting story, is that Prohibition had become a tremendous political force. The problem with Prohibition was that the federal government was dependent on liquor taxes to fund the federal government. And so the federal government basically said to the prohibitionists, you can't have prohibition unless you can find us another source of revenue. And the other source of revenue became the income tax. And the income tax amendment and the prohibition amendment were both enacted at about the same time, maybe at the same year. And another interesting Delaware story is that Pierre DuPont was a vigorous opponent of prohibition. And the DuPont family fought hard to get rid of prohibition. Why? Because they believed if they got rid of prohibition, they'd get rid of the income tax. And Pierre DuPont was very angry when prohibition was repealed, but the income tax wasn't. We went from an unregulated market during the Gilded Age to a regulated market during the Progressive era. And then after 1960s, we started reverting to a deregulated market, and particularly deregulated financial markets. So the Gilded Age was pockmarked with financial crises, just as our period is pockmarked with financial crises. The difference is there was no Federal Reserve during the Gilded Age. The Federal Reserve wasn't created until 1913 or 17, somewhere around in there. And it was created because J.P. Morgan, who had principally been behind organizing the wealthiest financiers to sort of underwrite the market. When the market took a dive, they'd start buying. Came to the government and said, "I can't do this anymore. You need to create a reserve bank that will step in and protect us from financial crashes." And that's when the Federal Reserve was created during that period. Monopoly power was a problem during the Gilded Age, and we have a similar problem now, particularly in the digital era. Antitrust laws were enacted during the 1890s. I think the Sherman Act was 1890. The Clayton Act was sometime in the early 1900s. Another change that occurred is that, at least after 1960, social norms about compensation changed. Putnam tells the story of George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was the head of American Motors and then became governor of Michigan. He was a Republican.
It's 7:30.
And he was asked at one point why he kept his salary. His salary was only like 3 or 4 times the salary of the average worker. And he said because it was important that the differential between the top of the corporate compensation ladder and the bottom not be too great in order for stability and a sustainable corporate. Well, now we're up at where compensation levels for CEOs is something like 300 or 400 times the level of the average worker, largely based on stock option gains, but not completely. Another change was the minimum wage. There was no minimum wage. Minimum wage was created, I believe, during the New Deal, but it may have been the Progressive era. I don't remember. But of course, as we all know, the minimum wage stopped being increased in the 1970s. And so the minimum wage at the federal level has, on an after inflation basis, been declining over these years. And all of those have contributed to the economic, the rise and fall of economic inequality. The move in politics from tribalism to comedy and back again. There was cross-party collaboration was very low in the 1890s. Very few bipartisan votes where legislation would be passed on a bipartisan basis, and the number of votes, if there were bipartisan votes from both parties, was very small. That changed during the Progressive era. You might remember that the progressive movement itself was bipartisan. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and he was probably our first progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, and he was our next progressive president. Herbert Hoover, who obviously has a reputation tarnished by the Depression, was actually quite a humanitarian and a progressive. And I never appreciated the extent to which progressive legislation and New Deal legislation and even Great Society legislation in the 1960s and civil rights legislation were passed by substantial bipartisan votes. I mean, to the point that the party that didn't support it or the minority party on the particular issue, at least 40% of that party would vote for the reforms, and often the majority of the party would. So the level of bipartisan action that occurred increased all through this period and peaking in the 1960s, and then, as we all know, has fallen off. I won't go into the divisions during the Gilded Age. Well, you can see them listed here on the chart. And society. Okay. Social solidarity reached a low point during the Gilded Age. We've already discussed a lot of that. I like this quote from Walter Lippmann, wrote a book in 1914 called Drift and Mastery. We'll come back to that in a minute. But he had this line in it, which I think reflects not only the Gilded Age state of society, but our own time. We have changed our environment more quickly than we know how to change ourselves. The Gilded Age was a period of people trying to cope with tremendous changes in their personal lives. I mean, the one was rural to urban. And we were, at least according to Lippmann, and I think from this other statistics and analysis that are reflected in the book, we weren't very capable of making that change. We couldn't change ourselves to adapt as quickly as the changes were occurring around us. John Dewey wrote the next quote: "The great society created by steam and electricity may be a society, but it is no community. The invasion of the community by new and relatively impersonal and mechanical modes of combined human behavior is the outstanding fact of modern life." Well, if that level of depersonalization occurred during the Gilded Age, we have another level of depersonalization that's occurring in our age through social media and the digital world that we are creating, where more and more of our interaction occurs digitally, as in on this Zoom itself. And with the pandemic, that's become, at least for me, almost overwhelming. So what changes occurred during the progressive era that reversed some of that social isolation? Well, the period from 1870 to 1920 was the period of the greatest expansion of nonprofit associations that ever occurred in our country. It was huge, and on this page are just listed a few of the hundreds of associations that were created during that period that continue to this day. They continue to this day, but their membership and participation is nothing like it was through the period really up through the 1950s. Churches, I think we're all pretty familiar with the rise and fall of churches, which is just a reflection of the rise and fall of social associations. I was surprised by these statistics that it's estimated by historians, and I won't go into the complexity of how they come up with these numbers, but that in the colonial America, maybe because it was such a rural nation, only 20% of the people belonged to churches. Church membership rose. There were three what are referred to as great awakenings in American history, religious revivals. One was in 1750, the second was the 1820s and 1830s, and that revival had a lot to do with the abolitionist movement. And in 1860, which also was involved in the abolitionist movement. Still, according to Putnam, in 1850, only 34% of Americans belonged to a church. Now, he says, without giving me statistics, that the percentage increased during the Third Great Awakening in 1860, and then apparently declined again. By 1910, 43% of Americans were members of churches. And he points out that, and I thought this was very interesting, that he is putting a lot of emphasis, and he's a liberal, on our social malaise and isolation, on the decline of churches, principally, I guess, not a value judgment so much about churches as simply an assessment that churches were such a big part of creating social cohesion in this country that the decline of churches has had an adverse effect on social cohesion. Of course, there's another side to that story, and that is churches were also a source of racism, discrimination against LGBTQ people, and other orthodoxies that were not accepting of dissent or deviation. And we'll get to that when we talk about the 1960s. But nonetheless, half of all associations in the United States related to or relate to churches or religion. People who attend church are 2 times more likely to donate to both religious and secular causes than people who do not belong to a church. People who belong to churches are 2 to 3 times more likely to volunteer both for religious activities and causes and secular activities and causes. I guess in one sense you can say people who are joiners are more likely to join churches and join other things than people who are not joiners. So church membership as a percentage of the population increased from 1890, about 43%, to a peak of 80% in the 1960s. Church membership has declined until today. It's dipped below 50% again, as it was in 1890s. And I think we all know what happened during the 1960s that attributed to the decline in church membership. Putnam says that a lot of it was relating to the sexual revolution and the perception on the part of the baby boomers. And it was principally baby boomers who left the church. The earlier generations stayed with the churches. So this was a generational change, not one that cut across generations. It was the baby boomers who left churches and caused the decline during that period. And a lot of that was attributable to the sexual revolution. In the 70s and 80s, church membership and attendance stabilized, primarily due to the emergence of the conservative religious right and the backlash to the sexual revolution and the backlash on abortion. Then after the 1990s, the millennial generation began to abandon the church in greater numbers, and attendance and membership again started to accelerate on the downside, partly due to the perceived conservatism of religion and change in attitudes about LGBTQ issues. Now, in the progressive era, churches played a substantial role in the reforms that occurred. In mainline Protestant churches, there was a very powerful movement called the social gospel. And I found this interesting that Putnam explains that there was a change not only in churches, but sort of in the theology, that before the advent of the social gospel, much of theology focused on personal salvation, both how to save yourself and sin. And that the social gospel started to change the focus of religion from the personal issue of salvation to the social issue of social justice and ethics. The other thing that happened to churches, that they expanded beyond just being places to worship, and churches started providing many other services to their members: healthcare, some sorts of insurance, educational programs, and social justice programs. And it wasn't limited to the mainline Protestant churches. The Catholic Church, primarily because of the most immigrants in the United States were Catholic, or many were Catholic, focused on workers' rights in particular. There was a papal encyclical that was issued in 1891 that actually rejected laissez-faire economic theories, which were the predominant theory at the time, supported the formation of labor unions, which were not necessary. In 1890, the formation of labor unions was a struggle, and fought for just wages, including minimum wages. I've already mentioned one evidence of the power of the religious movement at the time was prohibition itself, and I've already explained its relation to the adoption of income tax. In terms of our social cohesion, as unions declined after 1960s, the social associations and the social solidarity that unions created for workers began to decline. Family formation shows the same rise and fall as the other metrics relating to social organizations. I found these I knew these, but I had never quite heard them presented in this way. The percentage of middle-aged persons married rose from the Gilded Age to 1960, and then began declining to its lowest level ever at the present. So in the Gilded Age, it was 65% of married, middle-aged people were married. It rose to 80% in 1960, and now it's declined now to 45% at the present time. And the age at which men and women married became younger from the Gilded Age to the 1950s and early 60s, and then declined until the oldest ages at present. So in the Gilded Age, a median age for a woman marrying was 22 and for a man 26. In the 1960s and late 1950s, the median age was 20 for a woman and 23 for a man. I think I was 23. I think Sally was 22. And now the median age for a woman is 27 and for a man 30. There's been a steady increase in the divorce rate. He points out there's been a substantial increase in cohabitation outside of marriage, but points out that in the top 1/3 of the income level, most people cohabitating end up marrying. In the bottom 2/3 of the income level, most people cohabitating, most of those end after 2 years, even when there are children. He also points out, and this is, to me was interesting, is that the view of marriage as a social institution changed. During the Gilded Age, and if I'm watching earlier periods with dynastic marriages and such, marriage was an economic institution as much as it was, and more than it was perhaps, a romantic institution. It was an institution for creating and raising children and sustaining families. And then marriage became more romantically focused. And the change in focus also increased attitudes towards what marriage should be, focusing less on what marriage should be in the context of the association, the family, extended or otherwise, and more on marriage, are you happy in your marriage? And that, according to Putnam, that change in focus is also part of the change from we to I. I'm not sure I agree with that, but in any event, and the percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds living alone increased from 33% in 2004. I wonder if I got that year right, to 51% in 2018. I'm not sure that year 2004 is the right, but if that's quite there's been a substantial increase in people living alone, particularly in that age bracket. Measures of social trust rose from 1910 to 1960 and declined to the lowest levels ever recorded today. During World War I, 73%, when people were asked, can most people be trusted? 73% said, yes, most people can be trusted. During the World War II, 73% said most people can be trusted. 77% said that in the period 1957 to 1964. 56% said that in 1983, and 33% said it in 2010. And just think about that for a minute. 2/3 of us think that we can't trust each other, or we can't trust most people. That is a pretty stunning attitudinal change. Putnam says that the 60s was the hinge. It was the pivot point of the 20th century. And he makes these points. Almost all historians agree that from 1968 to 1974 was a period of rapid change, but they disagree about the reasons for, the value of, and the effects of that change. The first half of the 60s were years of hope. JFK's inaugural that I already mentioned, the Civil Rights Acts, Great Society, immigration reform. The second half of the 60s, the Vietnam War, assassinations of Kennedy, the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, the rise of the Black Power movement and the reaction to it, the law and order reaction, and stagflation. What he says is that the 60s became a period of dysfunction, and that created disillusionment and disengagement that turned people's focus from we to I. That as people became disillusioned, they became disengaged, and they became more focused on themselves. Now, this is a quote from Walter Lippmann. The chapter that Putnam has that deals with what can we learn from the progressive movement is titled Drift and Mastery, and it's named after a book that Walter Lippmann wrote when he was 25 called Drift and Mastery. It was 1914. In that book, Lippmann said America suffered from the drift of overwhelming despair and called for the mastery of history by an active, inventive, disciplined citizenry. I mean, I could read you a part of Putnam's book where he starts off and he describes a society, and you think he's talking about our current age, and he actually tells you at the end of the several pages that what he's just described was the Gilded Age. But I think this drift of overwhelming despair and the need for us to be able to marshal some level of mastery to deal with this, Lippmann thought it was true in 1914, and I think it's true now. But here's the point that Lippmann made that Putnam wants to reiterate. This reform that needs to occur, it has to be done not by some wise and superior being, but by the American people themselves. No one man, no one group can do it all. It is an immense collaboration. And then Putnam goes on to say that the reformers during the Progressive era and into the New Deal and after were a cross-section of all types of people, immigrants and elites, women and men, blacks and whites, housewives and career politicians, unionists and capitalists, college graduates and factory workers, top-down bureaucrats and bottom-up activists, Republicans and Democrats. And if I were to say what's missing from our current reform efforts, that would be it. That our reform efforts are very socially segregated. And we've got a terrible social divide, particularly when you talk about college graduates and factory workers. And he points out that the reformers during the Progressive era had different immediate aims. They weren't all fighting for the same thing, and sometimes they disagreed with each other on, some were supporters of one thing and opponents of another. Sometimes they had contradictory impulses. But according to Putnam, they shared two principles: a determination to stop what they perceived to be the downward drift in American society, and a belief in the common man, a belief that it could be done by regular people.
Mike and Ada, just a quick mention, we're about 10 minutes out.
Okay.
Thanks.
And here's the point that Putnam makes that I thought was of most interest to our church group because, well, I'll read it. The progressive movement was, first and foremost, a moral awakening. Americans from all walks of life began to repudiate the self-centered, hyper-individualist creed of the Gilded Age. As an early leader of the social gospel wrote, "The trouble lies deeper than government or business reorganization. It is in our primary conceptions. What we have got to have if we want the true democracy is a different kind of men and women to whom duties are more than rights, service dearer than privilege." I've got to say, I'm I'm of a mixed feeling about moral awakenings, because sometimes moral awakenings can get in the way of pragmatic change. But I do think I accept the idea that if we're going to have the kind of change in our society that we need to get out of where we are now, there is going to have to be what I'll call a humble moral awakening, not a self-righteous moral awakening. Another aspect of the reform was muckraking journalism and literature that brought problems of other people to the attention of what was essentially a middle-class progressive movement. And then Putnam says that we need to translate the outrage and the moral awakening into active citizenship. He emphasizes finding pragmatic solutions using social science, an openness to experimentation that's not premised on ideological beliefs from one side or the other. The importance of reforms that can occur at a local level. It doesn't all have to happen, or even maybe most has to happen at a federal level. In fact, I went back years ago and looked at all the major reforms that occurred at the federal level, and almost all of them followed the same change being done at a state level before it could be done at a federal level. So state change is a precursor to federal change. But he also makes the point that, and he says there are a lot of different problems that we need to address. He makes this, I like this statement, our current problems are mutually reinforcing, and their solutions must be as well. There is no one problem that will fix this. There's no one problem that will even substantially fix it. We've got a lot of different things going on, and they're reinforcing each other in a downward cycle. And then he makes this point, 2 points. Democracy is a long game, and I've seen this point made elsewhere, that change occurs during a crisis. But before the crisis, between the crises, activists need to create the policies and tools that can be employed when the crisis occurs. In fact, one of the biggest proponents of that was Milton Friedman himself, and the conservatives have used that over the last 40 years. They first created think tanks and movements that created the conservative philosophies, policies that have now become our country. And Putnam makes the point that it took decades, 6 decades, for the progressive movement to reach its pinnacle. And so that's why democracy is a long game, and there were a lot of losses along the way. And then the last 2 points that he makes was that the leading progressive reformers were young when they began. Reform will require the energy and longevity. Oh God, sorry. Thank you. The longevity of the young. And I got to say, in the Democratic Party right now, it is, I think it's going to be critically important for the gerontocracy that currently controls the Democratic Party to step aside and let young people come in, because these reforms that are going to occur that we need are going to require their energy and the longevity of young people. People in their 80s are not going to be around to finish this task, and so we better start bringing younger people into the process to get that done. And then he lastly makes a point that progressives managed to fashion slow and steady reform as alternatives to calls for revolution. They compromise when necessary and work within the system. And I think that's important. I've seen it just recently, and we've all seen it, both at a federal and a state level. It's great to have ambitious goals, but to sacrifice or to allow deadlock to occur and not get anything done because you can't get everything done, I think is a mistake. And Putnam seems to suggest that was true for the progressives, that they made
It's 8 o'clock.
slow change. They made changes on a slow and steady basis at the local level and then at the federal level. They couldn't get everything all at once, but they got it bit by bit over the years. And that is it.
Great. Thank you, David. As usual, very thorough and very interesting, and we appreciate your time putting this presentation together. And it's 8 o'clock now, but I'll open it up for some questions for those who want to ask David a question. Please chime in.
Calling to remind Rogers of an appointment at 10 a.m. with Dr. Guy Webster on Tuesday, August 4th.
I'll have one, David. Maybe you can
Okay.
basically your presentation talked about the book and Putnam's comments, and I'd be interested in understanding what you consider, or maybe even Putnam considers, kind of the biggest issue of inequality after 1960. And, is it taxes, education, or wage compensation? What would you think would be the dominant issue?
I don't know what he would say is the dominant issue. I think that, I guess the impression I would get from the book, and I've heard him speak, so I'll give you two answers. From the book, from what he wrote in the book, I think he would say the dominant issue is focusing too much on ourselves, too much I and not enough we.
Mm-hmm.
Too much focus on individual rights and not enough focus on the community. But he doesn't mean, he's not meaning individual rights in terms of discrimination, because he makes the point throughout that the movement, the great failing of the progressive movement was that it wasn't inclusive, particularly in terms of race. And so an entire huge segment of America was left behind and didn't participate didn't participate fully, I'll say, because I don't think he would say that blacks didn't participate at all. I think he does think there was progress made, but didn't participate fully in the reforms that occurred. And Sue has given a tremendous history lesson on that problem, and we can't make that same mistake. I think I heard him ask a question when he gave a lecture at the Grand. He was at the Baby Grand a couple years ago. The Delaware Community Foundation sponsored him, and he was asked the question, what do you think was the single greatest reform that was made during the progressive era, and what do you think would be the single greatest reform we could make now? And he said that the single greatest reform that was made in the progressive era was the institution of universal free secondary education. Then he said, but today I think the greatest reform we could make now is early childhood education. And in fact, as I learned from Sarah's work on paid family leave, the amount of benefit that can be created just by allowing babies to have parents with them during the first months of life those benefits can be huge and pay dividends throughout their lives and throughout the community. So, you know, early childhood education, yes, but also good child care. And so to me, we have a huge problem right now in that we underinvest in our own children. And we have been underinvesting in our children for at least 40 years. Or maybe investing poorly, because maybe we don't spend the dollars the way they should be spent. I think I've heard that criticism also made. But we could make tremendous progress, but only over decades, if we invested more in our children at their earliest, at the beginning of life and in their earliest years. So.
Yeah, I agree to that. Any other questions? Yeah, Roger.
I didn't have a question, just a comment that the book we studied last fall was called Moral Ground, about a lot of essays about climate. Hyper-individualism was identified as one of the contributing causes and one of the things we really have to get away from if we're going to solve this. We have to recognize that we are dependent upon each other. And all of this, everybody's got to have this, I got to have my car to get to work, to my job, and I'm going to be alone in the car, and I have to own this, and I have to own that, and I have to have this. And rather than saying you have to rely on the community, you know, you have to go next door and buy a vegetable. You have to, you're all in this together. And all of this me stuff is a very strong contributor to the climate situation we have now.
Yeah, and Roger, I was going to mention this book that I just got. I read about it in the New York Times, The Precipice, The Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity. And it talks and this is a gloss that Putnam doesn't get into, because as much as I think there are similarities between the Gilded Age and now, and that there's a lot we can learn, I think we are confronting problems now that are much greater existential threats than anything that threatened us during the Gilded Age. And he, in this book, The Precipice, mentions three: nuclear war, climate change, and artificial intelligence. Now, I haven't read the book yet, but he does it all, I think, at least in the reviews I read of the book, in the context of not only not thinking just of me, but also of thinking about future generations. And how do we develop the kind of moral grounding that not only expands our horizons beyond ourselves to the whole group, but even to future people? And because there are these existential threats. The other book, and I've always got a list, The Rise and Fall, the Neoliberal Order, is the discussion of the rise of the neoliberal order is the prevailing political economic views since really the Reagan Revolution, and it's the emphasis on free markets, the emphasis on free trade, the emphasis on American power, and the book is basically saying that order that neoliberal order has collapsed. It collapsed as a result of the financial crisis, and at an economic level. It collapsed as a result of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War at a geopolitical level. And because of our social problems and the rise of Trumpism, it has collapsed politically, both on the Republican Party side, where that neoliberal order is now being rejected by Trumpism, and on the Democratic Party, where it's rejected by the by the Bernie Sanders supporters and others. I mention that because Putnam seems to suggest one of his criticisms. He's got a fair amount of criticism of the. I didn't mention this. I should have mentioned it. One of the things he says in the 1960s is it was the hinge era where we switched from we to I. It happened in the conservative side, primarily in the economic arena, where the conservatives said, you got to free me from economic constraints so that I can make as much money as possible, because that kind of market is the best for everyone in the long run. And on the liberal side, you've got to free me from your prejudices, your sexual morals and conservatism. You got to free me to live my life the way I want to live it. And so I've heard David Brooks make this same criticism, that both on the left and the right, there was a philosophical shift from we to I. On the right, it occurred at an economic level. On the left, it occurred at a social level. I think there's truth to that, but I think the bigger change that's occurred is the one that's described in another book called Evil Geniuses. It's the conservative movement that was formulated in the 1970s. There was a plan put together in the 1970s by conservatives and wealthy people in this country in a memorandum written by Lewis Powell, who went on to become the Supreme Court Justice, who described how the conservatives would take the country over. And they knew it would take them a long time to do it. That probably happened faster than they expected with Reagan's election. But what we see right now in the Supreme Court, in Congress, in schools, are the fruits of a 50-year plan by the conservatives, the Federalist Society. I think that is, to my mind, a bigger contributor to the shift from we to I than the sexual revolution or other things in 1960s that Putnam points to. But that's where I would disagree with Putnam.
Okay, thank you. Any last minute questions? If not, I'll go ahead, Roger.
Last one, to take your theories and his theories, what we should be doing then is on the state level, begin to push for early childhood education and child care, and then hope that gets taken up across the country as a model. So that really focuses, as we need to do, we need to focus on one particular thing. And I think that would probably be an excellent program.
Well,
Sure
I got to
is.
say, I raised with Sue as a Peace and Justice of the, and I don't know if I have the energy for this or the capability of putting the people together, although I started talking with some people about it, of what, for lack of a better word, I would call the Westminster family project or family policy project, that to try to put together. I mean, what was driving this is that there's been a lot of talk on the conservative side, but thoughtful conservatives who are opposed to abortion and saying, okay, well, we got our way on this abortion thing now, at least as a constitutional right, but we've got to answer the criticism that we don't invest enough in children, that we're bringing these children into the world, we need to invest in children. And so there are some voices on the conservative side that are saying we need to do more for our children. And Delaware is small enough that it seems to me that if there is to be some sort of bipartisan movement on families, if there's a genuine willingness on the conservative side to support policies that promote families, whether they're government policies or social policies, because it doesn't all have to be done by the government. Now's perhaps the time to try to try that. Anyway, sorry to go on and on. I just
That's quite all right. All right. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and especially David for putting together a great presentation. And I wish you all a great weekend. Thank you for your time.
well,
Thank you very
thanks
much.
everybody.